The first words I heard after 3 years of silence were about my funeral. It is an odd way to return to the world, an ordinary sentence folded into the hollow of a house, ordinary as the clink of a cup, and yet it landed like a splinter. I was standing at the top of the back stairs, a teapot cooling on the counter below, and there it was, my daughter's voice, low and conspiratorial, saying the word as if it were a scheduling detail. My name was not spoken aloud in that first moment. It was assumed, understood. Funeral, cake, after party. For 3 years, the house had been a geometry of touch and light. I learned its angles with my hands. I could move through the kitchen in the dark and bring out the right cup, because memory annotated the world in friction and temperature. The worn groove under the faucet where my thumb used to rest, the way the kettle's handle caught at the same notch as the cabinet knob. Sound was a thing that belonged to other people's rooms and the television down the street. My life had become a catalog of silent substitutes. I read faces like Braille. I listened with my skin. The accident, when it happened, it felt like a punctuation mark that stopped the sentence of my life, left me deaf in one instant, and set my days to a new tempo. I learned to answer to a different rhythm, the door's vibration under a fist, the flashing of the phone by the lamp, the small mechanical language of a washing machine. I taught myself to hear again through sight. Sarah took on the tasks that needed an ear, calling the doctor, sorting the bills, making the innocuous arrangements of daily life that had once been mine. We adapted, politely and gratefully, because that is what grown children do when a parent becomes fragile. There were afternoons when she read to me, voice steady and careful. There were dinners where she laughed, mouth wide, and I smiled at the timing of her joy. I believed then, as any mother would, that love would hold the seam. 2 weeks ago, a bright clinical day under the fluorescent hum of Dr. Harrison's office changed that arrangement. He called it a trial implant. He called it experimental in the way a surgeon reads the weather, precise, measured. I am a nurse by profession. I know the language of risk. I know that experimental is not the same as miracle. But I also know that the gap between what is possible and what is necessary can make a person brave. They had offered me a procedure that might restore enough hearing to let me navigate the world without captioning and without the constant polite translations of a child. The first morning after the hospital, I sat very still in my bed and listened for what I could not name. At first, there was only a thin electronic whisper, like a moth trapped in the attic of my skull. Then gradually, the small clarities returned, the kettle's whistle rising, the soft percussion of the radiator, the neighbor's dog barking in a cadence I had forgotten existed. My breath sounded like an intruder. I waited for disappointment to come, an error, an infection, some cruel administrative cough of fate, but none came. Each new sound felt like a page turned. I let Sarah believe that I was not fully certain. I wanted the world to reveal itself slowly, without fanfare. I wanted a private re-education, a ceremony without witnesses. For days I tested the sounds like delicate instruments, children playing in the courtyard, the way the mail slid into the box, the breath of the clock in the hallway. I learned to place new sounds inside the maps my hands had drawn. The squeak of the gate now matched the green rust stain on the hinge. The cadence of the milk truck matched the crack in the sidewalk by the third step. Each thing fit like a bone rediscovered. I do not regret the secrecy, not at first. It felt like a small, unambiguous joy to keep something so intimate to myself. I savored private victories. The first time I heard rain without turning my head towards the window. The first word Sarah mouthed that unexpectedly landed as a sound in the room. It was a gift, and a fragile one. I handled it like a glass I had to move through narrow corridors. On the third day, after I could hear properly, I diffidently rose to make tea and heard Sarah on the phone downstairs, her voice muffled by the sackcloth of the stairwell, conspiratorial in a way I had only ever believed existed in other people's lives. I was halfway down the stairs before I had the sense to freeze. Old instincts will not die. The nurse in me remembered how to listen without being seen, how to listen to voices and pick out their rhythms for assessment. "We'll call it a celebration," she said. "Something bright. That way people won't—" her voice softened, a practiced intimacy. "Won't ask too many questions." "Make it a fall thing," another voice, David, I knew it by tone now, responded. His voice had that gravel he cultivated, the dangerous charm of a man who owed more than he could remember. "Get the place tidy, get the flowers, and we'll make sure it looks peaceful. You know what I mean, love." There it was. Not the explicit plan I would have wanted to hear, not a plot with diagrams and timetables, but the geometry of intent. A party arranged, a narrative set, a woman's life reduced to an item on an inventory list. They were talking about smoothing things over and taking care of the will. The way people talk about the weather when discussing the rest of you pressed at me like a bruise. For a dizzy second, I wanted to step out and confront them, to wrench the phone from Sarah's hand and demand an explanation until the truth lay naked on the floor. Instead, I stood with my hand on the banister and listened. That choice, between a heat of immediate confrontation and a cold, insistent gathering of proof, was the first real act of power I exercised since the world stilled. I am old enough to know what hysteria can look like. I am old enough to know that grief can mask many things, and that accusations without evidence are a kind of self-harm that leaves the accused and the accuser in ashes. I have also been a nurse long enough to understand the forensic virtue of patience. When you suspect a heart has an arrhythmia, you do not shout, you monitor. If something is wrong with a medication, you check orders, trace boxes, and reconcile counts. It was professional instinct and a profound private rage that told me not to say anything. If you enjoy real lifestyle suspense stories, subscribe. After that day, sound became a tool as much as a miracle. I learned the household anew by listening. I learned the hesitation in Sarah's voice when she lied, the particular timbre David adopted when he was pretending at affection. I began to notice small professional things, the ways pills were left in a dish rather than a labeled container, the soft sound of pages turning in a notebook that held lists I was not permitted to read, the hush on nights when they whispered in the kitchen because it was better for me that way. I listened to the house breathe. There are things people do when they believe their schemes are hidden by a disability. They lower their guard, convinced they have one more advantage. They say things aloud that they would not otherwise. They reveal patterns. For all the tenderness Sarah had shown me, patterns began to emerge that were not maternal. There were late-night conversations on the porch where laughter was used like nail polish, bright, glancing, meant to distract. There were bank notifications that arrived in the trash can instead of in a drawer. A small drawer in Sarah's bedroom, under a stack of envelopes, kept bulging with folded receipts and numbers I recognized from the hospital. The kind of invoices that mark money moving not for repairs or for groceries, but for debt settlement and arrangements. I could not prove anything by watching receipts, but a nurse learns to notice anomalies before they are proven. I did what a good nurse does in a crisis. I collected what small, discrete pieces of the story I could without contaminating the scene. I made mental notes. I opened the pill box and counted what should be there. I did not pry into private bottles, but I compared the rhythm of refills with what should be. I watched Sarah answer the phone and recognized the inflection of urgency in a man I had only glimpsed once, David, when he swallowed his guilt into a practiced charm. There was an edge to the way he spoke about money, an impatience like a fever. But I am a mother too, and mothers carry a different ledger. When I repeat aloud the lullabies I sung over Sarah, the hours of feverish care at 2 a.m. when she threw up in a paper bag, the way I taught her to sew a button when she was ashamed of needing help, those memories press against suspicion like balm. There is a certain cruelty about being the person who suspects her own child. It makes you feel as if your heart is a ledger too, with pages you must mark for both love and reason. I kept listening. I started to leave my phone, an old brick with a cracked case, where I could see them, but it could not be seen. I recorded conversations on it, not in the way of a spy novel, no hidden devices placed in muffins, no complicated schemes, but simply because I had become lucent with a knowledge I could not risk losing. I learned to capture evidence in the simplest ways. If I found a conversation worth saving, I let it play. I did not, for my own conscience, edit or splice. I recorded, time-stamped in my mind, and stored it. Making recordings felt like traitorous work. It felt clandestine, and yet it also felt like a textbook reapplication of the careful documentation I had kept in an ICU. Who said what, at what time, who gave what medication. The ethics of it sat heavy. My hands shook when I played something back, because I did not want to hear my daughter's voice say things that would tear at the fabric of every memory I had of her. But once I could hear it, the ache became a kind of clarity. It sharpened. The sound of them planning something that involved me as an event rather than a person lodged in my bones. I called Henry Walsh, my lawyer, because the world of law is where you translate feeling into action. Henry had been my mother's lawyer once, and mine after that. He is a man of small attentions, papers in neat stacks, a voice that sounds like he has washed it on a Sunday. He did not try to comfort me as a friend might have. Lawyers are not built to comfort. They are built to translate suspicion into protocol. When I told him the basics, about the surgery, about my hearing, about what I had heard, he was quiet in a way that suggested he was cataloging rather than soothing. "You did the right thing by not confronting them," he said finally. "Rage is useful as a body temperature. Evidence is what you bring into court." He used words like chain of custody and documentation in a way that made my chest tighten. He asked me to place anything I recorded into a folder and not to tamper with it. He asked me for names, dates, receipts. He suggested a financial audit. I listened to the unsent tenderness in his voice. He was looking at me not as a mother whose family had splintered, but as a client whose assets might be at risk. When Henry left, he took with him a sense of order I badly needed. He gave me a checklist in the manner of a nurse. Gather documents, do not confront, do not destroy evidence, alert no one unnecessary. He did not call the police then. He said it might alert the wrong people and ruin the opportunity to build a case. He used phrases like preliminary investigation and civil protections, so I would not think we were walking toward a melodramatic showdown. It felt like a rehearsal for something far more coordinated. My strategy cemented into a few brutally simple aims.
First, confirm intent. Did they merely fantasize about an easier life, or was there a plan with steps and accomplices? Second, preserve evidence in a way that law would accept, which meant no theatrics, no traps of my own. Third, ensure my safety, because the more I learned, the more likely danger found me by association. Fourth, consider a contingency. If the house was compromised, we would need to move quickly and preserve assets. The list was clinical. It felt good. I spoke to Mrs. Patterson that week, because some alliances are as old as the neighborhood. She had been a nurse too, and her kitchen smelled of oats and lemon cleaners. She was a small woman with a fierce sense of privacy. I told her, carefully, that I was uncertain and needed someone to check in now and then. She offered to be a witness without prying. She would come by for tea and keep an eye. I felt ridiculous to need the company of a neighbor for such a thing, but a witness is sometimes an antidote to loneliness and the quiet manipulations of the house. The more I listened, the more pieces I found. A checkbook register with numbers that recommended inquiry, bank transfers that landed in accounts not associated with any home improvement contractor. The sullen way David moved through the kitchen now, hands rough, muttering at himself, felt like a man who had swallowed debts he could not explain. Sarah started to use the word inheritance as if it were a commodity that could be scheduled. She spoke, sometimes, of arrangements with an intimacy that made my throat close. They spoke of making things clean and nice, as if those adjectives could anesthetize the moral ache I felt at being plotted against. I rehearsed scenarios. I told myself I was not looking for revenge. I told myself I wanted safety and clarity. The real reason I withheld my hearing was not spite, but necessity, to know the architecture of the plot before I confronted it, to discover whether the voices were the murmurs of a child cornered by desperation, or the cold professional planning of people who had decided to monetize a mother's death. I refused to reduce the choice to sanctimony. There was a strategic cruelty in keeping silent. It felt like nearness turned into reconnaissance. There were nights when I woke in a sweat, imagining incriminating moments, missing pills, misfiled financial instruments, a doctor mistakenly contacted who might write an instruction I did not want. I am a nurse. I understand the language of bodies and of medications. That knowledge made me cautious. I did not want to invent crimes where none stood. I also did not want to be the naive old woman who, by trusting too much, becomes a victim in front of her own kitchen table. Once, in a small victory of cunning that made me laugh, I placed an extra pack of paracetamol on the counter in the morning and watched to see if it moved. It was not the act that mattered so much as watching Sarah's hands when she thought no one was looking.
The way she hesitated over the packet, the way her fingers crinkled it as if to test weight, these were the little economies of betrayal. I did not call it evidence. I called it information. Information is the thing that turns suspicion into action. At the same time, I practiced my restored ears in public. I went to the post office and listened to a cashier's melody. I sat on a bench and let the city lay itself out. Bus brakes, children's shoes, a dog that sneezed like a caught thing in its chest. Sound, once deprived of periodicity, floods and confuses. I learned restraint the same way I had learned to unstop a wound, slowly, with sterile hands. The most corrosive thing, perhaps, was the memory of the lullabies. When Sarah was small, her face was a map I could read without sound. She used to hum as she tied her shoelaces. She would sing as she stitched her doll's seams. To reconcile that past with the woman plotting about a party felt like tearing a photograph in two and seeing both images remain true. I found a specimen on one of Sarah's nights alone, a scrap of paper with names and numbers, circled amounts in a handwriting that tilted when the writer was anxious, an invoice for a settlement with a number that matched a transfer I later found on a bank statement. There was a man, David's friend, Vincent, one of those names that tastes like regret, whose number appeared in texts with urgent, impatient language. I did not call him. I copied the paper into a folder and stapled it. Evidence is a physical thing. It demands that you treat it like linen, not like rumor. It took me a week to set the legal gears in motion. Henry advised that before we involved police, we had to be certain of financial misappropriation, because without that, we might be dismissed as a family dispute. He recommended an auditor who had worked with him before and who would be discreet. He advised against confronting them until the case had shape. I obeyed. Discretion felt less like cowardice and more like the slow work of a surgeon. The days folded like that. Small investigations seemed into larger ones. I would awake to the new array of sounds and let them fill me. I listened to Sarah's footsteps and compared them to her laugh recorded on a quiet evening so I could hear what exactly she said when she was not acting. I listened to the rustle of financial papers. I learned to hear the things people thought they had hidden. There were a dozen little betrayals that grazed me before I could collect bruises strong enough to press my hand against a wound. Sarah called me love with a thinner sincerity than before. David began to dominate conversations with flippancy that made my palms sweat. They argued about moving some money in tones that made me think of a fisherman tucking bait away from the net. When Sarah talked to her friends and I pretended to watch television, I learned the way she explained my frailties as if they were conveniences instead of tragedies.
She told one friend, as if it were the simplest thing, that I wouldn't know certain details about the house, that Mom is content with her garden. She won't notice. The word content has a faint, damning air in that context, as if the person the word describes is only a landscape. The home, which had been my shelter, felt for the first time like an instrument tuned to produce something I had not consented to. Sound that once nourished now served as evidence. I had to make peace with the unnaturalness of that metamorphosis. A nurse remembers that sometimes the body betrays itself. Sometimes the body is used by others. My limbs did not tremble when I met this new, investigative incarnation of myself. I had been patient and meticulous for many decades. I knew how to wait and how to pounce when the time was right. And there was the birthday party to consider. They spoke of it often, in the half-fluent way people speak of rehearsals. "We'll make it a nice thing," Sarah said, and the way she used the possessive made the word nice feel like a radical act of theft. She wanted a gathering of family and friends, a celebration that would cloak darker intents. For me, birthdays had always been a way of threading a life into a calendar. I had planned cakes when Sarah was a girl with a clumsy hand. I had organized the games and then watched her shine. The thought of a party being used as a facade made me feel queasy in a very motherly way. Parties are social contracts, and this one felt like it would be used to write an ending for which I had not consented. I considered canceling it outright, but the nurse in me knew better. People who plan to harm often need the ordinary scaffolding of ritual to feel safe. A sudden refusal would not only arouse suspicion, it would also rob me of witnesses, of the opportunity to see these people in context. Henry agreed, with the coldness of someone accustomed to geometry. If they plan to do something, they'll likely do it when they think the world is least watchful, he said. It is better to be present and to turn the event into a controlled environment. My presence felt like both a confession and a strategy. I arranged small things. I called Mrs. Patterson to ask about flowers. I wrote down guest names and dates. I pretended to shop for a dress, and for the first time in years I bought something soft and blue. I practiced hearing the world as an ally rather than an intruder. With each small public appearance I gathered more data. I learned who would attend, who might stand nearby, and who might carry the conversation into the shadows. Yet something else began to stir in me, less the cold calculus of evidence, and more the warmth of vengeance disguised as justice. There is a small human satisfaction in turning the instrumentality of one's betrayal back upon the betrayer. I do not mean the kind of malevolent triumph that leaves you soulless. I mean the clean work of reclaiming agency.
Sound had returned to me, but with that return came something more. Clarity. I could hear their plans. That clarity, once cultivated into proof, would force a reckoning that was not my small, private revenge, but a public restoration of truth.
The days narrowed toward the party like the narrowing of a throat. I forced myself, in private, to remember small mercies. Sarah's hand on my face the night I was admitted after the accident, her teenage insistence on making me tea, the way she would bring me a sweater on cold mornings. People are not wholly villainous because they make cruel decisions. Anger is a complicated geography. David, I suspected, was a man who staggered under debts he could not see a way out of. Sarah was perhaps a woman who saw a route to securing a life, and even as she schemed, still loved me in ways too tangled to parse easily. When you are old, every action has consequences that ricochet. My decision to withhold my hearing from them was not purely tactical. It was also a protection for myself against the delirium of confronting beloved deceit without structure. I wanted them to show me who they were without my asking, to reveal the architecture of their intentions, so that when the ruin came, it would be with evidence in hand. There were nights when the house felt like an instrument tuned for revelation. I would sit in my armchair and let the grandfather clock mark hours with a noise that felt like the slow thud of a heart under an exhilarated surgeon's palm. I listened to the sounds and cataloged them: the soft buzzing of the refrigerator, the pattern of footsteps on the floorboard near the study where Sarah often wrote in small, neat hand. I practiced patience the way one practices prayer. I knew then that I would have to act with a blend of tenderness and implacable clarity, that the choice not to tell Sarah about my hearing would be read by some as a cruelty. They might say I poisoned the family with distrust. That would be a fair accusation emotionally. Legally, though, words are thin things until anchored by documents, receipts, recordings, and witnesses. My duty, first to myself, secondly to justice, was to anchor those words. On a Wednesday morning, I sat with Henry and the auditor, a woman named Claire with a face like ledger paper and a voice that suggested she slept with numbers under her pillow. She explained in a way both slow and precise what a financial audit would entail. She would look for anomalies, transfers, irregular withdrawals, changes in beneficiaries. She would not, she said, sniff around where there was no scent. She would build a pattern. She would show sequence. I told them everything I had heard and everything I had seen, and then, with a small residual guilt, I confessed to the recordings I had made. Henry nodded as if this was a typical variation on a theme. "We will proceed carefully," he said. "We will not alert Sarah or David yet. If there is criminal intent, the police have to be involved in a way that preserves evidence. We will need to coordinate that later, but the first step is building a financial picture that justifies that coordination." It felt strange to be handing over my life in such small, technical pieces. A sworn statement here, a list of dates there. I had expected the work to be more theatrical. Instead, it was the tedium of bureaucracy, the kind of slow folding of paper that, when done properly, becomes armor. I slept that night with my jaw unclenched in a way I had not been able to for months. There were practical acts I took on my own, always careful to avoid crossing lines Henry had drawn. I reorganized my medication and wrote on a sheet of paper the names of every pill I took with doses and refill dates. I made a list of the bank accounts I knew belonged to me, their last known balances. I wrote down the contacts Henry had suggested we watch, the numbers for the auditor, a detective Henry had worked with in the past. I felt ridiculous and powerful in equal measure, this ledger of the self laid out like a map. After weeks of listening, evidence began to cluster. Claire found transfers that did not match home improvement invoices. A contractor's name turned out to be a shell. Receipts that had arrived in a neighbor's mailbox were for services that had not been performed. Small amounts, aggregated, traced to accounts that, when followed, led to a man who had been mentioned once in conversation. It was not proof of murderous intent. It was, however, proof of financial manipulation. And in law, financial manipulation is often the back door through which more ominous intentions walk. As the party approached, my plan crystallized. I would be present. I would not tell. I would test. I would let them reveal their plans in a public space where witnesses were plentiful and where the law could step in without suspicion of theatrics. I would study their faces and their small gestures and place every scrap I found in Henry's hands. I would not, under any circumstance, resort to violence. Violence solves nothing. It leaves you hollow. I wanted to be full, filled with rightness, with evidence, with a legal process that would hold those who had plotted accountable. There were small domestic rehearsals I staged on my own to prepare. I practiced slurred speech,
an old woman's deceptive falter, so that I could test reactions without endangering myself. I rehearsed the moment I might discover something so that it could be recorded as part of the event rather than something manufactured after the fact. I walked the house and placed myself where I could hear but not be easily observed. Each rehearsal felt like a betrayal of my maternal self, but it was the hard arithmetic of survival. The idea of public reveal felt like a small gospel of justice. If they had any decency, the weight of the room would shame them. If they had none, the law would take over.
I owned neither the energy of a vigilante nor the desire for petty revenge. I owned instead a person who had been stripped of dignity and would not let the narrative be written in the margins. There were moments of private sorrow. Watching Sarah hang a photograph of our family in a frame she had chosen without asking felt like witnessing a performative intimacy. She kissed my cheek with a quickness that suggested guilt. At times she seemed wholly unaware of the magnitude of what she discussed in whispers, and at other times I saw the focused look of someone who had calculated a necessity. People who live under debt sometimes choose expedience. People who love sometimes cross terrible lines. I carried both truths. On the morning of the party, the house smelled of lemon and the spice of a cake yet unfrosted. Plates were stacked in neat arrays. Guests' names filled a card we had pinned to the mantel. I moved through the rooms like a woman who had rehearsed for a play she had never wanted to perform. I walked into Sarah's room and found, tucked under a paperback, a small bottle whose label I did not recognize. I photographed it with my phone, no invasive manipulation, just a record, and placed the image into a folder for Henry. That act was small and surgical. It felt like honesty. I had not told Sarah, I had not told David, I had not told Mrs. Patterson beyond the fact that I wanted company during the party. My silence had cost me intimacy, and in a way had allowed me a kind of clarity. When people ask why I kept it secret, I tell them this: some truths can be kind when whispered quietly, others become weapons. I chose the latter because the danger was a knife, and the only way to map a blade is to hold the handle steady and see where it points. At noon, neighbors began to arrive. Laughter threaded the rooms like a ribbon. I set myself in a chair from which I could hear most of the house without being the center of attention. Sarah moved through the room like a hostess who had practiced compassion and convenience in equal measure. David stood near the door, hands jammed in his pockets, as if he wished to be ready to leave at any second. He smiled. His lips moved in a way that did not reach his eyes. I had prepared myself to feel a particular devastating sting when confronted with outright betrayal in the open. The first public instance of that sting, however, was not a declaration. It was a small sound I had come to notice, a muffled cough and the soft rustle of paper as someone moved a file under a jacket. It was in those smallnesses that a plot reveals itself. The criminal, like the surgeon, leaves telltale marks, patterns, repetitions, the human need to secure privacy for impure acts. I sat back and listened. The house sang a song I recognize now. The clink of cutlery, the murmur of conversations, the way someone laughed and then cut off when a camera pointed. I felt, with an odd mixture of grief and righteous cold, that everything I had been denied, the right to hear my daughter's true voice, was about to be returned to me as evidence. The party was only 3 hours away. I had enough to make a case for an audit and to call the police anonymously if needed, but not enough to guarantee arrests. That, I knew, would take more patience and a larger net. I watched, listening for the moment when they would reveal if they had a plan beyond financial maneuvering. When my daughter whispered with a friend and used a phrase about making it easy, when David's phone buzzed with a name that matched a number Claire had traced, the geometry of their scheme sharpened. What I did not know yet, and what the house would not tell me until it chose to, was whether their intent carried a violence that demanded immediate intervention, or a cold, bureaucratic theft that would be more bruising than lethal. I could feel the lines diverging in my chest. Either way, the night would change us all. I sat in my chair, the room full of the sound of others, and waited for the shape of the next move. The years of silence had taught me that listening could save you. I had chosen not to tell my daughter about my hearing restoration because the truth, when revealed too soon, can be weaponized. I intended to use it instead as an instrument of proof. The house hummed. Somewhere a fork scraped a plate. The clock settled into its patient count. When they brought in the cake and the guests gathered to sing, that would be the moment I had to decide whether to unmask it all in front of them or to continue the slow accumulation of evidence that might, in the end, bring a more complete justice. The choice for me had never been between silence and truth, but between immediate, ruinous exposure and the careful architecture of accountability.
I tipped my cup of tea and listened to the swirl of its steam. The sound of it was small and perfect and entirely mine. The sound of it was small and perfect and entirely mine. When the first chorus rose, neighbors gathering around as they always do, voices layered like quilts, I felt the shape of the evening settle into place. People sang the polite song of birthdays, a tune whose syllables meant duty more than joy, and I let them. My throat was dry with a kind of ceremonial calm. I had chosen my moment. Now I would let it become a moment that could be witnessed. Sarah moved through the room with practiced gentleness. She greeted guests as if she were passing out favors, all warmth and curated tenderness. David hovered at her shoulder, offering jokes that landed thinly. He laughed too loudly at things that were not funny. Around them, the house hummed with small talk, garden updates, mutual neighbors' illnesses, the sort of conversation that fills the gaps so no one has to look too closely at the seams. I had rehearsed one little thing for this precise juncture.
I set my teacup down with a sound I had learned to make when pretending to be fragile. Not the brittle collapse of an old woman, but the slower, slightly off-balance noise of someone whose balance had become a precaution. It would be small, it would seem believable, it would not be dangerous. The trick was not to act too convincingly. Too much theater would invite suspicion, too little and no one would notice. I had practiced the breath, the slow hand to my throat, the softening of my voice. The patient art of deception is a strange thing for a nurse, but it is not wholly foreign. In hospital wards, we learn to read the body as if it were an open book, to simulate pain to test reflexes, to mimic symptoms to watch for reactions. Tonight, I was using the same tools in the service of discovery. A niece pressed forward with a song she thought would be light. As the line of voices reached its peak, chairs scraping, plates being shifted, a camera clicking, Sarah came to my side with the genial urgency of a woman who believed she was protecting someone fragile. "Here," she said, very low, a breath intended for just my ear. "Take this. It will calm you. David called Dr. Harrison. He said something that might help for the nerves. Just a single tablet." She extended a small, plain capsule on the pad of her hand, like an offering. Her fingers trembled a fraction. In the shadow of her palm, I recognized the motion I had seen a dozen times, the practiced concealment of risk beneath the language of care. I let my eyes blur with the practiced haze. I cupped my hand around hers as if to steady her, and I let the slowness of my speech do the rest. "Oh, darling," I murmured, voice thick. Maybe taste it first." That was the small surgical test. If her hand moved to insist, to bypass decorum, then I would know with what economy of cruelty she had rehearsed roles. If she refused, the thing would be exposed as a domestic fiction. Her hand did not hesitate. She lifted the capsule toward the corner of my mouth with a softness that felt like a transaction. At that very moment, I felt a shift, a little click beneath my chair, where a camera had been left by a neighbor who liked to film family events. I had asked Mrs. Patterson earlier if she would keep a camera rolling. She had smiled at me as if it were a small piece of gossip to be shared over tea later. "Old things need witnesses," she had said. "I can manage a camera." So a camera recorded the motion of Sarah's hand as surely as my own phone recorded the hushed exchange 2 nights earlier when she had spoken of funerals. I let her place the pill between my lips, but I did not swallow. I whispered something faint about breath and let the pill sit there as a prop.
Then I expelled it in a small, deliberate act, an old trick learned in wards when you had to avoid taking something that would react with treatment, and discreetly palmed it before sending my hand to my throat in a way that made the gesture look like a difficulty in swallowing rather than subterfuge. A beat of confusion crossed Sarah's face, a micro-expression that when you are trained to read it feels like an answer. She tilted her head to David, seeking confirmation. He laughed too loudly, the laugh of a man eager for reinforcement. "Old sockets," he said in a voice I now recognized as practiced derision. "You always complicate things, Mum. Just take it. It'll be nothing." It would have been easy in that moment to rise and walk away and call the police into an empty dining room, to drag the whole nightmare into the light on the spot. But the slow arc of our plan required that evidence be incontrovertible in the eyes of the law, not just obvious to a room of shocked neighbors. Henry's counsel echoed in me. Evidence, chain of custody, witnesses. We needed proof that would survive scrutiny in courtrooms and in the hands of skeptical prosecutors. If I wanted justice rather than a messy family scene, I had to be patient even as my hand shook.
I let the scene wash past for a single heartbeat longer, then made the decision I had rehearsed. I would perform a decline so convincing my daughter would have to show what she truly planned to do. I pressed my palm to my chest as if breathless and let the room's murmur swell into a concerned hush. "Oh, Margaret," someone said. Sit down." Sarah moved as if automatic, pulling a glass of water. She offered it with both hands, like an offering. "Just water," she said, too quick. "Cold water first." I took the glass with both hands and set it to my lips. As I pretended to sip, I tapped my phone, secretly and lightly, turning on the small recording app Henry had told me would be crucial. The phone lay warm in my palm. Its microphone was a simple instrument, and crucially, it was the kind of thing any ordinary person might hold. The legal team later would call this admissible domestic recording because I had not altered it. It was what I had heard in my own house. Sarah's face changed when she thought I would swallow. There was a tightness at the corner of her mouth, an arithmetic of panic. She put a hand to my cheek and said something she did not mean to be overheard by everyone. "Please, love, just nap afterward. It'll be best. We'll sort the rest." The phrase, "we'll sort the rest," landed like a drop of oil in viscous water. David's voice, low, said something almost inaudible about arrangements and making it look like a natural decline. I had the words I needed, the ones I had already heard once, now repeated in a different cadence, in a setting where witnesses filled the air. It was enough to move beyond suspicion. It was enough for Henry to talk about arrest. But I could not reveal it yet.
Not with the police in the doorway, and not yet with the criminal network shadow still loitering beyond David's acquaintances. So I did what I had practiced. I exaggerated a fainting spell. I let my eyes close and slid from the chair in a slow, harmless way that read as frailty. The room shifted into an immediate, involuntary care. People surrounded me. Someone called my name. Sarah's hands were on my shoulders, and for a jagged second I could see her whole face open into what could have been grief, if grief had been sincere. David's smile had evaporated. He was suddenly all angles, a man moving to smooth seams. Then Detective Morrison, whom Henry had called in a few nights earlier to give preliminary details and request standby support, stepped through the doorway. He was not in uniform. Henry had advised discretion to avoid startle reacting the wrong people. Detective Morrison looked like someone who had been waiting in the wings for a long time. He moved toward us with the professionalism that had reassured Henry when he had mentioned him, quiet, efficient, and with the authority of someone who could turn an ordinary domestic evening into a legitimate scene of criminal inquiry without spectacle. He spoke softly to me, kneeling at my level as if I had truly been a patient. "Mrs. Thompson, can you hear me?" he asked. The choice in my chest was a private, loaded thing. To tell him yes would mean we had to reveal my hearing to a man who would then cashier the information into a procedural ledger. To tell him no would mean bringing law enforcement into a household where they would be slow to act. But Henry had already briefed him. The detective knew. I said in a voice that held the same cool clarity I had been practicing for weeks, "Yes, I can hear." That admission was a pivot. Sarah's hands tightened. There was a single lurch of heat across her face, an open-mouthed panic I had not seen before. David paled. Guests stood frozen like spectators in a theater, uncertain whether the show had turned into fact. Detective Morrison took out a badge, and then, as England's old chestnut goes, unrolled a wrist. He did not shout. He moved through the room with method. He asked a neighbor to hand him a camera, collected statements from those nearest, and crucially, asked Henry to play the recordings I had brought him. Henry touched his coat as if to steady himself, then cued the audio. I had not planned on theatrics, but I had planned for clarity. Henry slid the phone into his hand and held it up in the now silent room. "Listen to this," he said, not for the room, but for the police officer's notes. He hit play. From a phone that had been a brick until recently, my daughter's voice came out as if someone had struck a glass. "We'll call it a celebration," she said, precisely as she had said it that first afternoon when I had overheard them. There was a hum beneath it where David's voice threaded. "Make it look peaceful. We'll manage everything."
The room responded in immediate, stunned waves. A sister-in-law clutched at her necklace. A cousin who had been laughing a moment before had gone pallid. Faces that had been animated by small talk hardened into the recognition that something had been planned in secret. The sound was incontrovertible. These were not isolated, angered remarks. They were patterns repeated over weeks, now presented as data. Detective Morrison asked Sarah to step outside with him and David to remain in the living room. He spoke to them in the way a man trained to secure a scene speaks, plainly and without accusation, giving the space for rights and denials. He explained that we had evidence of financial manipulation and possible arrangements involving a vulnerable adult's assets. He was careful with his words, possible and allegation, as if the language could cushion the room against hysteria while also ring-fencing the facts. When he placed the pair under arrest, it was not dramatic, it was efficient. He read the rights, and an officer in plain clothes took out handcuffs. Sarah's eyes met mine in a single vertical shard of a moment. There was something like pleading there, but it was muddled with calculation. David said nothing. He stared at the woodwork as if trying to find an escape route in the grain. I sat very still as they were led away. I felt the heat recede from my chest in the manner of an anesthetic. It was not triumph I felt, but a clinical fatigue. The house was suddenly too loud, a choir of displaced voices. Neighborly murmur rushed into the spaces left by Sarah's absence. After the arrests, the process was steady and necessary. Detective Morrison and his team took statements, photographed the pill vial I had photographed earlier, cataloged the items of evidence from my recordings, and took custody of the audio files. Henry and Claire, who had come once more at Henry's request, handed over the financial anomalies they'd traced. Claire had with her a stack of printouts, bank transfers, contractor invoices, and a series of numbers that had once seemed harmless, now assembled into narrative like pieces laid out in a morgue. No one promised me a particular legal outcome. Detective Morrison was careful. He explained the process as if reading me a script in small, deliberate paragraphs. Arrests are the beginning, not the end, and prosecution depends on prosecutor discretion and the sufficiency of evidence. If anything, the legal world insisted on breaks. Arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to defraud and financial exploitation, Detective Morrison told me, and then added in a softer voice that he would bring the evidence to the Crown prosecutor and they would advise. He used words like preliminary charges and investigation ongoing. When I asked about immediate safety measures, he arranged for a protective order to ensure that Sarah and David could not access my accounts. After the commotion ended and guests drifted outward like smoke, I sat in the quiet with Mrs. Patterson, who poured tea and proffered what she called neighborhood consolation. She was a small, fierce woman who did not ask for details. Whatever you need, she said, whatever comes next will help. Her presence anchored me more than the legal forms had. I felt the old, steady muscle of communal care, the kind that had kept wards and households together for decades. The first nights were bureaucratic. Officers came and went. Statements were taken in my kitchen, in my living room, and once, because I asked, at Mrs. Patterson's house, where I felt less like an exhibit and more like a person with a file in a drawer. Henry moved through the motions with a quiet competence, his presence soothed in the way only someone used to the language of paper could. Claire continued to trace funds, and with each piece she uncovered, the contours of the scheme sharpened. It became clear over the following weeks that the story was more complicated than a simple theft. David's debts were deep, and not all debts are equal. There were small transfers to accounts connected to two men I had heard about in the whispers on the porch, Mr. Vincent and Mr. Clark. They were not names I had ever wanted to meet. In the notes I read later, redacted for privacy, Detective Morrison described them as part of a net in the urgency and fear that had nested in David's voice when he spoke on certain nights. At Henry's request, the police placed the pair under further scrutiny. They had arrested Sarah and David on suspicion of conspiracy and financial exploitation. They were now looking outward to the enablers who had pushed a man like David to a breaking point. The idea of debt breeding coercion was as old as ledgers. The reality felt cruder and more urgent. Sarah was taken into custody and held at a facility where visits were allowed under supervision. I was not sure what I expected of the jail visits. I had imagined anger, a face turned sharp and accusing, or composure. The first time I saw her, she was small in a plastic chair, hands folded as if in prayer, her hair a messy halo of fatigue. She looked older than the woman who had plotted in corners. "Margaret," she said as I sat across from her, her voice breaking not with shame, but with a rawness I had not permitted myself to expect. I'm so sorry." There were 1,000 ways to respond. I could have unleashed everything that had been coiled into me for weeks, the sense of being plotted against, the nights of listening, the recordings, the receipts. But I had chosen, from the very beginning, a form of justice that did not require theatrical condemnation. It required measured confrontation and the acceptance of complexity. So I listened.
David had not yet pleaded. He was held in separate custody. Sarah's hand shook as she talked. "He owed people, Mum," she said. "Bad people. He said he'd sorted. He said he had a plan. I didn't want you to get hurt. He kept saying they would take everything, that they'd come for us. I thought, if I could make things easy, if I could change the paperwork, he would stop. I thought..." She trailed into a thin breath. Her eyes were wet with a fear that looked like repentance and like the terror of someone negotiating their own survival. "It's not that I wanted you to be dead," she said finally. "I swear it. I just thought, if you didn't have the burden of the house, They couldn't get to you. It was selfish. It was stupid. But they were in our lives, Mum. You don't understand what it's like to have men at your door asking for other people's skin in return for debts. She framed the explanation as if she had been a ship driven by currents stronger than herself. There was truth in that reading. There was also culpability. The law is rarely interested in the poetry of desperation. It measures action and consequence. I asked her about the pills. I asked her about the transfers. She admitted to moving some sums under direction to accounts she believed would stave off debt collectors, not because she wanted us poor, but because she was scared. I thought I was buying time, she said. It was foolish, and then it got worse. She spoke of David with a complicated tenderness and fear. He sunk in, she said. I tried to be the one who pulled. I thought if I could handle it, he'd breathe. But the men he owed, they were more than men who took bets. They were violent in other ways. They threatened him. They said they'd come after us if he didn't settle. They weren't joking, Mum. I had known, in the quiet of the house, that someone was pressing from the outside. The calls at 2 a.m, the anonymous slips of paper left on the mat, these had been the kind of signs that a debt had teeth. But the intimacy of coercion was new when one heard it straight from an accusatory that was also a confession. The detective, when I spoke with him after the visit, explained that coercion, threats, and extortion changed the moral calculus of crime. It did not remove responsibility, it contextualized it. Sarah and David would face prosecution. The more the police uncovered of the external network, the stronger their case would be against those men who had pushed them, the ones Henry had called professionals in intimidation. Detective Morrison broached a plan carefully. They had to get at the creditors, Vincent and Clark. Both men were not only creditors, but the detective said, facilitators of fear. They had names and addresses and a network that reached into places Henry's civil audit had not been able to penetrate.
The police had an idea. If we could offer Vincent and Clark a payment or a meeting where they thought they would collect the remainder of David's debt, they might take the bait. They had investigated enough to know the men would follow money. What they needed was a participant from the inside to make the meeting seem credible. Mrs. Thompson, Detective Morrison said, leaning forward in his chair with a professionalism that masked a plain human question. Would you be willing to assist us? You would be under full police oversight, you would be wired to record any exchange, and it would be a controlled operation, no independent action on your part. We'd coordinate everything. You would not be alone. It was a proposition that bristled with moral complexity. On one level, I could not imagine anything less natural than an elderly woman walking into a room to confront men who had threatened her family. On another, this was an opportunity to cut at the head of the problem, rather than to watch the disease spread. The sting offered the possibility of recovery, of severing the link between debt and threats that had almost consumed my daughter. I thought of Sarah in the plastic chair, her hands folded as if in penitence and fear. I thought of the ledger of nights I had spent listening and of the deep, corrosive power of secrecy. If the law could use me as bait to catch men who profited from fear, and if that might in turn protect others from the same terror, it felt like the only morally coherent path forward. I agreed. There were precautions. I would not be alone. Detective Morrison insisted on the presence of an arrest team nearby and plainclothes detectives in the restaurant. The money would be marked. The transfer trail would be traceable. Henry and Claire would be on call with their documentation. I would wear a device that recorded both my conversation and situational audio. I would be briefed on what to say, scripted phrases to make the meeting credible, and on where to sit. It was, in the way of police work, an exercise in minimizing risk by maximizing evidence. On the day arranged for the meeting, my calms were an archive of small nerves. Mrs. Patterson came with me as moral support. She would sit in the same restaurant, a few tables away, bearing the kind of presence only long friendship can provide. Henley rode with me to the agreed location, a restaurant that had the right mix of noise and semi-private booths. Detective Morrison took a seat near the doorway, eyes on the room like a hawk's. The men arrived in the way they always do, late tans, late suits, the kind of clothing that says you've borrowed status to buy fear. Vincent and Clark moved together, an alliance between men who treated intimidation as commerce. They sat opposite me, palming the money they believed was to be handed over. They smiled as if the whole world owed them currency. My hands were not trembling now.
The amplified sound in my ears was precise, murmurs of cutlery, the small scrape of a chair leg, the breath intake of a man calculating his next profit. I felt both small and enormous. The device at my collar hummed with the quiet assurance of law. I have the payments, I said in a voice I'd practiced, steady, weary, entirely believable. David told me to bring this. Proper exchange, then we're clear.
He said once this was done, they'd leave us alone. Vincent's eyes crinkled at the corners, a greedy bird's look. "We can make people comfortable," he said. "You know what that means." They reached for the bag of money we had supplied, money that had been marked so the police could follow it if they needed to. The slow intimacy of the exchange felt like a ritual of predators. They couldn't know that the bag had been watched, that every slip of currency would create a paper trail. At the signal, a simple nod from Morrison, 2 officers rose from the periphery and moved in like a net closing. The arrests were swift and professional. Vincent and Clark raised hands, startled and then furious. There was no gunplay, no theatrical scuffle. The detectives moved with the discipline of men who had worked similar scenes many times before and wanted to avoid drama. Handcuffs clicked. Miranda warnings were read. The restaurant's noise returned like a tide. For a moment, I felt not exhilaration, but relief. Relief that the men who had pressed Pretz into David's life would now be on record and in custody. The evidence collected in the sting, recordings, the marked money, and my testimony became part of the police case file. Detective Morrison assured me he would prepare a full investigatory brief for the Crown. "This should strengthen the prosecution considerably," he said. "You did the right thing by coming forward and working with us." I did not feel like a hero. I felt like a woman who had been handed back a measure of agency and had used it in a way that kept with law and dignity. The operation had been controlled. I had not been asked to commit or condone anything outside the bounds of the law. I had been present in a way that allowed the law to act. The legal aftermath took its slow, bureaucratic time. Charges were filed against Sarah and David, counts of conspiracy to defraud and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Vincent and Clark were charged with extortion and related offenses. The prosecution's office told me that charges had been based on a compilation of recordings, financial audits, witness statements, and the sting evidence. There was a cautious optimism in Henry's voice when he spoke of the next steps. He reminded me that in the law, certainty is often elusive, and outcomes depend on negotiation, proof, and sometimes the unanticipated mercy of judges. A prosecutor interviewed me and described gently the road ahead. "We have a strong case," she said, "but remember that plea bargains and negotiations are common."
The precise outcome, sentences, fines, restitution, is not something we can predict. Some recovery may be possible, some may not. Certain outcomes are, frankly, indefinitive until the court calendar finds its way. I did not envy the prosecutor. The justice system is an engine of slow gears that must balance retribution, remediation, and rehabilitation. I had wanted a clean result: restoration, compensation, punishment. The reality of law is messier. Henry advised me to focus on what I could control: moving assets, securing a new place to live, and channeling my experience into structures that would protect others. We were able to secure a temporary protective order, preventing any access to my bank accounts, and an early hearing froze some transferred funds pending investigation. Claire's audit uncovered enough irregularity that the bank agreed to hold disputed transfers for further inquiry. Some funds were reclaimed, others were tied to accounts now subject to legal processes beyond our immediate control. The arithmetic of recovery was partial and frustrating, but it was not nothing. Sarah and David entered pleas, and the legal machine took its patient, relentless course. Sarah cooperated with investigators in exchange for consideration, providing information about the debt network and her interactions with Vincent and Clark. Whether her cooperation would materially affect her ultimate sentence was something the prosecutor said could not be guaranteed, and when asked, Henry advised I not to make moral judgments based on courtroom outcomes. "You did the right thing," he told me more than once. "Justice happens in many forms." Months passed. The vicissitudes of courts, counsel, and counsel's counsel drew out the process. Vincent and Clark faced stronger charges given the sting evidence in some victim statements. Their arrests liberated certain pathways for the police to follow. They were not, however, the end of a large network. Detective Morrison kept me informed when he could. He was a steady presence when the shadows of litigation lengthened. As the legal proceedings unfolded, my life underwent small practical changes. I sold the house, an act that felt like closing a chapter I never expected to leave. There was a complicated mixture of grief and relief in packing the kitchen items that had been my world. The house had been the stage of both my happiest years and my most intimate betrayal. Selling it felt like the right action. It also felt like a physical severing of memory. I bought a small cottage by the sea, modest and stubborn in its cheer. It had a low porch and a kitchen window that looked over rocks and grit. The move felt like a recalibration. The first nights I slept to the sound of waves and the low, constant murmur of unseen water. Sound, once the herald of danger, slowly became the herald of ordinary life again. Coffee percolators in the morning, gulls arguing, fishing boats chugging in the distance.
For the first time in months, sound was not an instrument of discovery, but a balm. In the months after the arrests, there were letters, cautiously written, from Sarah. She expressed regret and confusion and asked for some kind of reconciliation. I read them with a palette of feelings: hurt, tenderness, the ache of maternal love. And then after a night, I wrote back, not in accusation, but in boundary. I told her that I wanted the truth, and that the truth now had to live in courtrooms and in actions, rather than in the private exchanges of two people with conflicting loyalties. I also set about turning the trauma into something constructive. With funds that had been protected and small donations from neighbors who had been appalled by what they'd learned, and with Henry's careful counsel on structure and tax implications, I established the Margaret Thompson Foundation, small at first, deliberately small, a focused project to provide legal and financial counseling to the elderly and their families. The foundation would not be a panacea. It would not promise impossible remedies. It would offer practical help, auditing support, referrals to vetted legal counsel, and a small emergency fund to help seniors threatened by financial predators. In meetings with Rebecca, who I hired as the first director, I found a new kind of work that suited the steadiness of the nurse in me. We set up guidelines for intake, created partnerships with local banks for alerts on irregular transfers, and arranged for volunteer neighbors to be trained in watchfulness, the art of being present without prying. It felt like a way to translate suffering into architecture that might keep another family from learning betrayal the way we had. The foundation's opening was modest. Mrs. Patterson cut a ribbon, and the local paper wrote a short piece. Community members offered their small expertise: an accountant willing to do weekend clinics, a retired paralegal offering pro bono counsel. It was not a spectacle. It was a practical, hand-shaped response to a problem that had been, until my surgery, mostly invisible to me, and perhaps to many others. The legal outcomes remained mixed. Some funds were returned through civil action. Some had been dissipated. Sarah's cooperation did influence some dispositions, but the precise sentences for all involved were left to the courts. Where the files recorded numbers, they were often appended with indefinito, outcomes contingent on plea bargains, future testimony, or appeals. Justice, it turned out, was not an event, but a shape that persisted, ongoing and imperfect. Through it all, I found that hearing had given me something more than the ability to perceive sound. It had restored to me a capacity for vigilance that was both moral and practical. The title of the story, the fact that I had chosen not to tell Sarah, was not in my heart an act of cruelty. It was a strategic decision born out of the kind of care a nurse learns to practice. Sometimes you isolate variables before you treat a patient, because otherwise you might kill them with error. I had kept my hearing private, not to punish, but to learn. What I learned allowed me to build a case that protected me, and, in the small ways I could, protected others. Months turned into a year. The foundation began to help people. Mrs. Patterson called me once to tell me about an elderly neighbor who had been saved from a similar scheme by a warning about an unsolicited contract. I found consolation in these small rescues. The legal world continued to spin its wheels. Sometimes the wheels felt cold. Other times they clicked into place and something moved forward. Occasionally, I thought of revenge in the sterile terms of justice. I thought of the satisfaction that came when evidence obeyed you and not the other way around. But the real joy, the thing that surprised me after everything, was the quieter pleasure of sound in neutral. I took up mornings in which I would sit on my cottage porch with a cup of coffee and listen to the world wake. Waves slapped at rocks like a repeating metronome. Distant horns announced boats heading out and home. A child somewhere nearby learned the word gull and delighted in shouting it. Sometimes Sarah sent an envelope with a short, careful note. I answered when I felt like it. The letters were a complicated geography of apology and explanation. I did not know whether we would rebuild a mother-daughter relationship that resembled what had once been. Perhaps we would not. Perhaps some bonds, once broken, take new shapes that are not the same as the original. That was a concession I had to make, that love is not a thing reclaimed by force, but by truth and time. On a weekday in late spring, I sat on my porch and watched the sea. The light made the waves look like a field of silver coins. I listened to the gulls arguing, to the distant laughter of children, to the kettle on the stove whistling like a small, patient instrument. It was in these tiny fragments of everydayness that my life had become bearable again, and, in small ways, purposeful. I reflected on the choice that defines this story, the decision to keep my restored hearing from my daughter. You might think that secrecy between mother and child is an unforgivable breach. You might think that a daughter should always know her mother's gifts and vulnerabilities. Those are fair thoughts. But what I had been given was not merely the ability to hear, it was the responsibility to use that hearing to find out if I was beloved or inventory. I had chosen then to be wiser than my heartbreak. I had kept sound close long enough to assemble the truth in a way that could be proven beyond the sentimental clamor of family stories. That restraint cost me intimacy for a time. It cost me the warmth of immediate confession, and perhaps something softer between me and Sarah.
But it also prevented a cruelty directed at me from being masked by care. And in preserving evidence, I preserved the possibility of redemption, not only for myself, but for others who would need protection from those who profit on the vulnerable. People often ask if I feel vindicated. The right answer is complicated. There were moments of vindication, when Vincent and Clark were held in court, when Claire traced transfers back to false contractor accounts, when the foundation helped another elder maintain their account integrity. Others were bittersweet. Sarah's apologies, David's silence, the sale of a house that had once been a domestic universe. The world doesn't wrap neatly. The law is not a machine that guarantees tidy endings. What it does offer, if you are willing to work with it, is a structure that allows for accountability. I worked within that structure. I did not tempt fate. I did not try to be a judge and jury. I cooperated, and I let the legal system hold people to account as far as it would. I also made peace with actions that the law could not rectify, shared memories, lost years, and trust that would need to be rebuilt. Now, when the wind stoops low and the gulls circle, I allow myself to listen, to file each sound in a ledger of small pleasures. There is a kind of grace in hearing children's shoes slap rhythm on a boardwalk, in the clack of a distant bicycle, in the invariable time of the tide. My hearing returned me many things, the obvious one, music and speech, but also an inner clarity. I hear the world, and with that hearing, I choose how to act in it. If this story moved you, consider supporting elder protection organizations or learning about local resources to protect vulnerable seniors. Share your thoughts below. What would you have done in my shoes? Your experience may be the very map another person needs. I keep a small notebook by my bed now. It is filled with receipts and small lists, phone numbers of volunteers, Henry's office hours, the names of those who helped in small ways. At the back of the book, I have a scrap where I wrote, once, the lullaby I hummed to Sarah when she was sick with a fever. Sometimes I hum it now for myself. The ocean is never far from my sight. Its sound is not dramatic. It is a continuous, patient music. It taught me something the night everything came into clarity, that silence can be a protective thing, and that sound, when wielded with care, can be a tool of justice. I chose not to tell my daughter about my hearing restoration, because for me, silence had become a strategy, one that allowed me to gather truth without being silenced again. In the end, let hearing restored to me was not merely the world of voices, but the agency to choose how to respond to them. That choice remains, in so many ways, the quietest kind of victory.